Marcus Thompson stepped out of his luxury hotel in London, his expensive designer clothes catching the morning sunlight. At 42, he was the kind of man who believed money could buy him anything, including respect. His wallet was thick with credit cards, his watch cost more than most people's cars, and his attitude was as inflated as his bank account. Finally, a real vacation, Marcus muttered to himself as he adjusted his gold-plated sunglasses. He had just closed a massive business deal back in New York, and now he was treating himself to what he called a well-deserved European tour. But Marcus wasn't just any tourist. He was the type who complained about everything, demanded special treatment everywhere, and truly believed the world revolved around him. His first stop was Buckingham Palace. He had heard about the famous royal guards and was curious to see what all the fuss was about. As his taxi pulled up near the palace gates, Marcus was already planning how he would get the perfect photo for his social media accounts. After all, his followers needed to see that he was living better than them. The morning air was crisp, and tourists were already gathering around the palace. Families with children pointed excitedly at the guards, couples took selfies, and tour groups listened carefully to their guides. But Marcus paid no attention to anyone else. In his mind, he was the most important person there. The royal guard stood perfectly still at their posts, wearing their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. Their faces showed no emotion. Their eyes stared straight ahead, and they held their rifles with military precision. These weren't just costume-wearing entertainers, as Marcus had assumed. They were real soldiers, trained professionals who took their duty to protect the royal family very seriously. But Marcus didn't care about their training or their purpose. He saw them as nothing more than tourist attractions, living statues put there for his entertainment. He walked up to the first guard he saw, a young man named James who had been serving for 3 years. James had stood through rain, snow, and blazing heat. He had ignored countless tourists who tried to make him laugh, flinch, or break his composure. "Hey there, toy soldier," Marcus said loudly, making sure other tourists could hear him. "How about you and me take a picture together?" He pulled out his expensive phone and moved closer to James, completely ignoring the clear barriers and signs that told visitors to keep their distance. James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had been trained for moments like this. The guard's job wasn't just ceremonial. They were active soldiers who could be called to real duty at any moment. Their stillness wasn't a game or a challenge for tourists to break. But Marcus took the guard's silence as a personal insult. His face turned red, and his voice got louder. "What's wrong with you? I'm talking to you." Several other tourists started to stare, some looking uncomfortable with Marcus's aggressive behavior. Parents pulled their children a little closer, sensing that something unpleasant was about to happen. Marcus had always been used to getting his way. As a successful businessman, people usually said yes to his demands. Waiters hurried to serve him. Hotel staff bent over backward to please him. And employees at his company rarely dared to challenge him. The idea that someone might ignore him completely was something his ego simply couldn't handle. "Listen here, you redcoat reject," Marcus continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "I paid good money to come to this country, which means I'm practically paying your salary. The least you can do is acknowledge me when I'm being polite." The irony of calling his behavior polite was lost on him completely. Other tourists began to whisper among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something worth recording. A few tried to catch Marcus's attention, hoping to warn him that he was crossing a line, but he was too focused on the guard to notice anyone else. Marcus moved even closer to James, now standing just inches from the barrier. "You know what your problem is?" he said, pointing an accusing finger at the motionless guard. "You people think you're so special with your fancy uniforms and your stupid traditions, but you're nothing more than museum pieces, living decorations for people like me to look at." The crowd around them grew larger, but not because people were supporting Marcus. They gathered because they could sense trouble brewing. Some visitors looked embarrassed for him. Others appeared angry at his disrespectful behavior. But Marcus was too wrapped up in his own indignation to notice that public opinion was turning against him. "My tax dollars probably fund this whole circus," Marcus continued, despite the fact that he wasn't even a British citizen and paid no taxes in the UK. And I demand some customer service here. You're going to smile. You're going to pose for my picture. And you're going to say, "Yes, sir," when I talk to you. James's fellow guards remained equally motionless, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the slightest tension in their postures. These men were brothers in arms, trained to protect each other as well as the royal family. They wouldn't break protocol, but they were certainly aware of what was happening to their colleague. Marcus's frustration reached a boiling point. He had been ignored, which was bad enough, but being ignored in front of all these people was unbearable. His reputation as a man who could make things happen was being challenged by someone he considered beneath him. "Fine," Marcus said, his voice now shaking with anger. "If you won't cooperate, maybe I need to teach you some manners." He looked around at the crowd, expecting to see support for his position, but instead saw faces filled with disapproval and concern. What Marcus didn't understand was that he wasn't just dealing with a person in a costume. James was a trained soldier who had served in real combat situations. He had faced actual dangers that Marcus couldn't even imagine. Standing still while someone shouted insults was actually quite easy compared to some of the things James had endured in service to his country. The tourists' threats didn't scare James, but they did cross an important line. There was a big difference between being rude and making threats against a royal guard. Marcus was about to learn that difference the hard way. As Marcus raised his voice even louder, hotel security guards who had been keeping a distant eye on the situation began moving closer. Police officers who regularly patrolled the area also started to take notice, but Marcus was too angry to see the warning signs around him. "Maybe you need someone to knock some sense into that thick skull of yours," Marcus said, his face now completely red with rage. "Back home, we know how to deal with people who don't show proper respect," the crowd gasped. Several people started backing away, realizing that Marcus was about to do something very stupid and very dangerous. Others began recording more actively, knowing they were about to witness either a major embarrassment or something much worse. Marcus had spent his whole life believing that his money and status made him untouchable. He had never faced real consequences for his behavior because people usually gave him what he wanted just to avoid trouble. But he was no longer in his comfortable world of business deals and corporate meetings. He was about to discover that some people couldn't be bought, intimidated, or bullied, and some mistakes carried consequences that no amount of money could fix. The moment that changed everything happened faster than anyone could have predicted. Marcus, completely blinded by his rage and wounded pride, did the unthinkable. He reached across the barrier and struck Royal Guard James directly across the face with the back of his hand. The sound of the slap echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. For a split second, the entire area fell into complete silence. Tourists stopped talking, children stopped playing, and even the birds seemed to pause their morning songs. Everyone understood that something terrible had just occurred. James barely moved from the impact. His training had prepared him for far worse physical challenges. But what Marcus had just done wasn't simply assault. It was an attack on a representative of the British Crown, an act that carried serious legal and practical consequences that the foolish tourist couldn't begin to imagine. Within seconds, the world around Marcus exploded into action. Royal Guard officers who had been stationed nearby immediately broke protocol and rushed toward the scene. Police officers appeared seemingly from nowhere, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Palace security guards emerged from positions Marcus hadn't even known existed. "Get your hands off me," Marcus shouted as the first officer reached him. "Do you know who I am? I'm an American citizen. This is a free country, and I have rights." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The officers weren't interested in his nationality, his wealth, or his indignation. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins was the first police official to take charge of the situation. She had been patrolling nearby when the alert came through her radio. 20 years of experience had taught her to read situations quickly, and she could see immediately that this wasn't a simple tourist misunderstanding. "Sir, you need to come with us immediately," Detective Collins said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. But Marcus was far from finished with his protests. "This is ridiculous," he screamed as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "I barely touched him. It was just a tap." You people are completely overreacting. He looked desperately at the crowd of tourists, hoping someone would support him, but found only shocked faces and people recording his humiliation. As Marcus was led away, James remained perfectly at his post. His face showed no emotion. Though a slight redness marked where he had been struck, he continued staring straight ahead. But those who knew him well could see the steel in his eyes had grown even harder. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed. Many had recorded the incident on their phones, and videos were already being uploaded to social media. Marcus had wanted attention for his London trip, and he was certainly getting it, though not the kind he had hoped for. At the police station, Marcus's day went from bad to catastrophic. He was processed like any common criminal, his expensive clothes providing no protection from the standard procedures of fingerprinting, photographing, and questioning. "I want to call my lawyer," Marcus demanded as he sat in the gray interview room. "And I want to speak to someone from the American embassy. This whole thing is a huge mistake, and I'm going to make sure everyone involved pays for it." Detective Collins sat across from him, her notebook open, and her expression unreadable. "Mr. Thompson, do you understand what you've been charged with?" she asked calmly. "Charged with what?" Marcus replied, still convinced this was all a big misunderstanding. "I didn't do anything illegal. At worst, maybe I was a little rude. But that's not a crime. You've been charged with assault on a royal guard," Detective Collins explained. "This is considered assault on a representative of the Crown. It's a very serious offense here in the United Kingdom." The color drained from Marcus's face, for the first time since the incident began. Doubt started creeping into his mind. Assault? Come on, that's crazy. I barely touched the guy. He didn't even react. The fact that guard James maintained his composure doesn't make your actions any less criminal, the detective replied. In fact, it demonstrates the professionalism you attempted to disrupt. Marcus's lawyer, whom he had called from New York, tried to explain the situation to him over the phone. "Marcus, listen to me very carefully," the attorney said. "British law doesn't mess around when it comes to the Royal Guards. These aren't actors or performers. They're active military personnel. What you did could be treated as seriously as attacking any other soldier." As the hours passed, Marcus began to understand the gravity of his situation. His initial anger gave way to worry, then to genuine fear. Phone calls to the American embassy provided no relief. They informed him that while they could ensure he received fair treatment under British law, they couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading far beyond London. Videos of Marcus striking the guard and his subsequent arrest were going viral on social media. News outlets picked up the story, and it wasn't long before Marcus's business associates back in New York were seeing their colleagues' face on television screens around the world. The headlines were brutal. Entitled "American Tourist Attacks Royal Guard," "Businessman's London Meltdown Goes Viral," and "Tourist Learns Hard Lesson About British Justice." Comments on social media were even worse, with people from around the world expressing their disgust at Marcus's behavior. Back in his cell, Marcus sat on the narrow bed and tried to process what had happened. Just that morning, he had been a successful businessman on vacation. Now he was an international embarrassment facing serious criminal charges in a foreign country. The gravity of the situation became even clearer when his business partner called with devastating news. "Marcus, I'm watching you on the news right now," his partner said, his voice tight with stress. "Our biggest client just called. They're pulling their contract. They don't want to be associated with someone who attacks soldiers." One by one, Marcus's carefully built business relationships began falling apart. Clients who had worked with his company for years suddenly found reasons to take their business elsewhere. His reputation, which he had spent decades building, was crumbling in real time. The woman who ran his apartment building's management company called to inform him that his neighbors were complaining. Several residents had seen the news and were demanding action. His gym membership was canceled. His country club was reviewing his status. Even his housekeeper quit via text message. But the worst news came from his elderly mother. who called from the nursing home where she lived. "Marcus, honey, what have you done?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Everyone here has seen it on the news. I'm so embarrassed I can't even go to dinner tonight." As night fell, Marcus sat alone in his cell, finally beginning to understand the full scope of his actions. He had thought he was asserting his authority over someone he considered beneath him. Instead, he had destroyed his own life in a moment of uncontrolled rage. The guard he had struck was at home with his family, having completed his shift with dignity and tact. James had received messages of support from around the world, with people praising his professionalism in the face of Marcus's attack. Meanwhile, Marcus faced the prospect of weeks or even months in British custody, followed by a trial that would be covered by international media. His business empire was collapsing, his reputation was ruined, and his future looked increasingly bleak. The entitled tourist who had woken up that morning believing himself above the rules was about to learn that some consequences can't be bought, bargained, or bullied away, and his hardest lessons were still to come. The courtroom was packed with reporters, tourists, and local residents who had come to witness the trial of the American businessman who had foolishly attacked a royal guard. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in his wrinkled suit, looking nothing like the confident man who had strutted out of his hotel just days earlier. His British attorney, appointed by the court since his American lawyer couldn't practice in UK courts, looked grim. "Mr. Thompson, I need to be completely honest with you," the lawyer said quietly. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. Multiple videos, from different angles, dozens of witnesses, and the testimony of several police officers. Your best option is to plead guilty and hope for leniency." But Marcus still couldn't accept reality. "There has to be something we can do," he whispered desperately. "Can't we argue that I was provoked? That guard was ignoring me on purpose. Maybe we can claim cultural differences, or temporary stress from travel?" His lawyer shook his head. "Mr. Thompson, that guard was doing his job exactly as he was trained to do. You weren't provoked. You were frustrated because someone didn't give you the attention you felt you deserved. No judge will see that as an excuse for assault." When the trial began, the prosecution presented their case with devastating efficiency. Video after video showed Marcus becoming increasingly aggressive, making threats, and finally striking guard James. The footage captured not just the physical assault, but also the entitled attitude and abusive language that led up to it. Guard James took the stand wearing his dress uniform, his bearing dignified and professional. He spoke in clear, measured tones about his training, his duties, and the incident itself. "I was performing my assigned duties when the defendant approached me," James testified. "He became increasingly agitated when I maintained my post as required. I did nothing to provoke him. I said nothing to him. I simply stood at my post as I am trained to do." The prosecutor asked, "How did you feel when Mr. Thompson struck you?" "I felt nothing during the incident, sir," James replied. "My training prepared me to maintain composure regardless of circumstances. However, I was concerned about the message his actions might send to other visitors who believe they can abuse members of Her Majesty's forces with impunity." When Marcus's lawyer tried to cross-examine James, asking if he felt the punishment should fit the crime, James's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Sir, I don't determine punishments. I simply serve my country with honor. Mr. Thompson chose his actions, and now he must face the consequences that British law provides for those actions." The courtroom was silent as several witnesses testified about Marcus's behavior that morning. Fellow tourists described his increasingly aggressive demands, his disrespectful language, and the threatening tone he had used before the assault. A teacher from Germany testified, "My students and I were visiting the palace as part of an educational tour. Mr. Thompson's behavior was so inappropriate that I had to move my children away. They were frightened by his anger and violence." A young couple from Australia said, "We were trying to take a nice photo when this man started screaming at the guard. It was embarrassing to watch. When he actually hit the soldier, we couldn't believe it. Who does something like that?" When it came time for Marcus to testify in his own defense, his lawyer advised against it, knowing that Marcus's arrogance would likely make things worse. But Marcus insisted, still believing he could talk his way out of trouble. "Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice shaking slightly. "I think this whole situation has been blown completely out of proportion. I'm a successful businessman who was simply trying to enjoy a vacation. I got a little frustrated when that guard refused to acknowledge me. But I never intended to cause any real harm." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who had seen every type of criminal excuse imaginable, listened with growing impatience as Marcus continued to minimize his actions and blame others for his situation. "I mean, let's be honest here," Marcus said, his old arrogance creeping back into his voice. "I barely touched the guy. He didn't even move. If he was really hurt, wouldn't he have reacted? This seems like a huge overreaction to what was really just a cultural misunderstanding." The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. "Mr. Thompson, you stated this was a cultural misunderstanding. Can you explain what culture you come from where it's acceptable to strike soldiers who are performing their duties?" Marcus stammered. "Well, that's not what I meant exactly. You said, Guard James refused to acknowledge you. What exactly did you want him to do?" "I just wanted him to be polite, maybe smile, pose for a picture. So when someone doesn't give you what you want, you believe it's appropriate to hit them?" "No, of course not. But, Mr. Thompson, you called Guard James a toy soldier and a redcoat reject. Do you consider that respectful language?" Marcus's face grew red. "I was frustrated. People say things when they're frustrated. And when words didn't get you what you wanted, you escalated to violence, correct?" "It wasn't violence. It was barely a tap." The prosecutor then played the video again, with the sound turned up. The sharp crack of Marcus's hand striking James echoed through the courtroom. "Does that sound like barely a tap to you, Mr. Thompson?" By the time Marcus left the witness stand, he had made his situation significantly worse. His testimony revealed not remorse, but continued arrogance and a complete failure to understand the seriousness of his actions. During closing arguments, the prosecutor summarized the case simply. "This defendant came to our country as a guest. When he didn't receive the special treatment he felt entitled to, he became abusive and ultimately violent toward a soldier who was serving his nation with honor. This kind of behavior cannot and will not be tolerated." Marcus's lawyer tried to argue for leniency, pointing out that this was his first offense and that he was far from home. But the damage had been done by Marcus's own words and attitude. When the judge delivered her verdict, her words were measured but firm. "Mr. Thompson, your actions represent not just an assault on an individual, but an attack on the institutions and values this nation holds dear. Your complete lack of remorse and continued attempts to minimize your behavior show that you have learned nothing from this experience. You are sentenced to 6 months in prison, followed by deportation and a 10-year ban from entering the United Kingdom. You will also pay compensation to the victim and cover all court costs." The gavel fell with finality. Marcus sat in stunned silence as the reality of his situation finally hit him. 6 months in a British prison, followed by permanent exile from the UK. His business was already in ruins, his reputation destroyed, and now he faced half a year behind bars. As he was led away in handcuffs, Marcus could see the satisfied faces of the spectators who had come to watch justice being served. The same people who had witnessed his arrogant behavior at the palace were now seeing him face the consequences of his actions. In the months that followed, Marcus's story became a cautionary tale shared around the world. The video of his assault and arrest was used in training sessions for tourist guides, showing them what kind of behavior to watch for and prevent. Guard James received commendations for his professionalism and became a symbol of dignity under pressure. He continued his service with pride, knowing that his composure had helped expose the character of a man who believed himself above the law. From his prison cell, Marcus finally had time to think about the choices that had led him to this point. He realized that his money and status had insulated him from consequences for so long that he had forgotten how to treat other people with basic respect. The entitled tourist who had started his vacation believing he could buy anything and intimidate anyone had learned the hardest lesson of his life. Some things, like honor, dignity, and justice, cannot be purchased or bullied into submission. When Marcus was finally released and deported back to the United States, he returned to a life in ruins. His business was gone, his reputation destroyed, and his arrogance replaced by a bitter understanding of how quickly everything can fall apart. The royal guard he had struck continued serving his country with honor, knowing that he had stood firm against someone who tried to break him, and in doing so, had helped teach the world a valuable lesson about respect, duty, and the price of entitlement.